You are listening to the Health for All podcast, and this is your host, Sanat Kumar. I hope you enjoy listening. For all the listeners here on the Health for All podcast, welcome to the podcast. I have a very interesting and a really exciting guest with me, Dr. Harish Pillai. Dr. Harish Pillai is a healthcare leader for over 2 decades now, leading hospitals and leading healthcare chains across Egypt, across Dubai, as well as India. He's has transformed, designed, innovated, as well as grown some of these biggest brands that we see across Asia as well as Middle East. At this point in time, Dr. Harish is a CEO at the Metro Pacific Healthcare Group in the Philippines, doing what he does best there as well. Thank you so much for being on the podcast, Dr. Harish, and welcome. Look forward to our conversation today.
Thanks for having me, Sanat. It's my pleasure.
Dr. Harish, your journey has taken you all the way from India, from a small town where you got your clinical doctor degree, and then you moved on to the city to some bigger brands. I see that you started to rechannelize the doctor in you very early on in your career, and you decided to take on the business side of healthcare. Walk me through that change and that calling that happened within you when you decided you want to do something more business oriented.
So these are, I guess, those crossroads in life, and which road we take makes all the difference in life. So in my case, I guess I fell in love when I was in medical college. I married my batchmate, who is my beloved wife.
Lovely.
And it so happened that my father-in-law, my would-be father-in-law at that time, I was just engaged after my the mandatory training period of residency, and he was based out of Bangalore in India. So he was a management guy. He's an HR guy.
Okay.
So getting to, obviously, when you're in a courtship and when you're into a relationship, you try to present the best of your would-be in-law.
Yes.
My dad-in-law had I think he kind of took me to his heart, and he always said that, Harish, there's a new dimension you need to explore. I mean, obviously, clinical aspect is great, but he felt that perhaps I should also think in terms of management. So that was one seed which I think got implanted in me. The second key factor was that I did my residency training in psychiatry in Bangalore at St. John's Medical College Hospital. So that was a pretty intensive 4 to 5 months of training when I got exposed to the fundamentals of clinical psychiatry. So I thought I was doing well, and all geared up to probably pursue a career in psychiatry. When at the end of it, I met my professor and my mentor, and I asked him, just as a like a review, what does he think of how am I doing? He said, well, I think you're doing good, but the bad news is that he doesn't think that I'm fit to be a psychiatrist. So I was a bit shocked. I said, why? Why do you say that? So he said that I'm suffering from a personality disorder. It's called anancastic personality disorder. And obviously, I knew what it meant. I mean, for a layman, it sounds like OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. So he said that your personality is suited for a few professions. One is the armed forces, military. You would be an excellent guy in the defense forces. Management is something which you have a great aptitude to. That is something you could. So suddenly, at the back of my mind, I was thinking of what my would-be father-in-law had advised me and what my professor, fully experienced, trained psychiatrist, is telling me. So I think these two incidents in my life accelerated the decision for me to take up management. I have to also tell you, I come from a middle class family. My father, I come from Trivandrum, the capital of Kerala. So my dad, being a typical middle class guy, obviously, unfortunately, I was good in studies in school. I studied in Dubai. I grew up in Dubai. I'm a second generation expat. So till the time when I couldn't clear the Arabic exam in my 8th grade, so I didn't have a rank in my school. So they left me alone because they thought I was a good for nothing guy. But then in 8th grade, unfortunately, I cleared my Arabic exam, and suddenly I became one of the top rank holders in my class. And that's when the expectation started. Hey, you have to be a doctor or an engineer. Whereas my dream was to join the Indian Air Force. I wanted to be a fighter pilot. I didn't want to go into all these things. So there was also that kind of middle class aspirational pressure of your parents that you need to probably go into the medical side. Believe
Yeah.
it or not, Sanat, that my dad built our home in Trivandrum in such a way that there's a consultation space, like a private chamber,
Oh, wow.
waiting area for the patients, and that's how my house was built. And then when I went and dropped this bombshell to my father to say that, Dad, I'm going into management, he just blew it, right? He just couldn't understand. He said, what are you doing after finishing medicine?
Yeah.
I thought you're going into clinical practice, and now you're
Yeah.
going into. He didn't know what healthcare management was all about.
Yeah.
But yeah, these were I guess, the key, I would say, snapshots in my memory bank about how I made the move towards healthcare management.
That is fascinating, Dr. Harish, and I love the key influences and roles that many people played in shaping this today. Interestingly, I've shared this with you before in our conversations. I always wanted to be a doctor as well, but my dad and my granddad, they come from a homeopathy background, right? So they're so ingrained. For the longest time, and the viewers may be shocked, and I may not be allowed in many vicinities if I say this, but I will say it. I was not vaccinated for the longest time in my life until I left the US. So, coming from an extreme family where homeopathy was the only source of truth, when I told my dad, I think medicine or Western medicine is something that I would be interested in, and not just humans, I'd probably be interested in the veterinary science as well. That's when it was a decision. I go become an engineer. He doesn't want to see me, in a shed, in a cow shed somewhere in a rural area. So fascinating. Thanks for sharing that. You've had some rich experience, Dr. Harish, and there's something that differentiates you from many other leaders that I've met over the last 12 years. There's a lot of warmth, there's a lot of empathy, and you decided to take on an extremely challenging position, right? During the face of a pandemic. Your position as CEO today, this was a time when there was so much uncertainty around the world. It was a new region, it was a new area that you were going to, and I'm guessing you didn't know the culture or the language of the space as well. And Southeast Asia, and being my home as well now, I know that it's not one country, it's many countries within a country as well. So with all that, right, how did you take on this challenge? How did you navigate through it?
So that's, I mean, these, I don't consider these as challenges. These are actually wonderful opportunities. And, it's life itself is a gift from the Almighty. And sometimes what defines your life is the choices what you make. In my case, I was pretty fortunate to have this very unique background. Like, I was born and brought up in the eastern city of Kolkata, which is a metropolis in eastern part of India, and I grew up in Dubai, which at that time in early 1970s was a booming emerging city, not the city of Dubai what you see today. So I grew up in that kind of an environment. And of course, I had this good fortune of traveling to different parts of the world. So change is something which I always welcome, because the juices in me gets kick in when I have unfamiliar environments and the opportunity to work with people who I've never met before. So I have to start from zero, from scratch. I have to again prove myself. I think that gives me a certain X factor, because it's totally unknown, right? And that excites
Yeah,
me quite a
yeah,
bit. Having said that, the advantage which I have is the grammar of healthcare around the world is the same, because
yeah,
eventually you have a patient who has got some sort of pain, physical or mental pain, and
yeah,
you have a provider who could be a doctor, a nurse, or a hospital setup. So these are common factors in the grammar of healthcare, irrespective of which country you work in. So that's what I have discovered. Of course, culture plays a key role in
yeah,
success or failure. So you need to be quite patient. You need to be willing to change your entire paradigm of understanding people and absorb that culture. So usually, one thing which always helped me was that I loved history right from my school days. I was
mm,
very fascinated with history. And even as a hobby, I'm a history buff. So I voraciously read about culture and people, everything about history. Uh, Before I came to Philippines, I spent a lot of time reading about the pre-Spaniard era of Philippines, which most Filipinos are not aware of.
I've
And
seen you
then,
say that quite a few
yeah,
times
so
in
I
many
was quite,
places. Yeah.
I was quite amazed at the vibrancy of this culture, like this
Yeah.
group of islands, how much they were connected to rest of Asia. They
Yeah.
were great, they were a great maritime nation with strong trade links with China, with Srivijaya, Indonesia, also the eastern part of India. So
Correct.
understanding that, and of course the colonial period, the Spanish era and the American era, the Japanese invasion, the
Yeah.
modern history of the Philippines. So I spent a lot of time studying history, and that gave me a fair understanding of culture because Filipinos are a very proud people, and
Yeah.
rightly so.
Yeah.
So it's not like you can come to Philippines and start because you are the CEO, you can make prescriptions from day one. That doesn't happen that way. You
Yeah.
need to win hearts and minds. You need to convince your colleagues of what you're trying to do and take them on board the journey. I think that kind of investment in being extremely patient, respecting colleagues, respecting culture, I think that's fundamental to at least beginning the journey towards collaboration and co-creation. This is what I really believe.
You spoke about some of the mantras that helped you, right? How did you think that was received as well? Whether it's in the Philippines, whether it's in Dubai, whether it's in Egypt.
Different cultures react in a totally different way. Like in Dubai, when I built a greenfield hospital in 2002, it was a multicultural environment because the nature
Yeah.
of Dubai is it's like a small United Nations. So
Yeah.
you had something like 35, 40 nationalities
Yeah.
working in that hospital. So
Yeah.
you need to make a judgment call of which is the market you are trying to cater to,
Yeah.
which nationality and what kind of skill sets really succeed looking at your target market in there.
Yeah.
I was also fortunate that if you look at nursing per se in Dubai, I had a team of acute care nurses which I brought from India, and whereas when we looked at non-acute care wards or even outpatient care, I had a large team of Filipino nurses working with me.
Mm.
And
Mm.
this kind of, and of course, I also had a lot of nurses from Eastern Europe.
Mm.
So
Mm.
this kind of a exposure to wide range of cultures, it teaches you quite a bit about eventually people are the same. It's just that
Exactly.
culture is something you need to understand and bring the team together. So that was Dubai for me in the early 2000. Egypt was very interesting because thankfully the mistakes which I made was quite earlier in 2006 when I went to Egypt. So I thought that, okay, I'm fresh from Dubai with this
Yeah.
leadership experience in Dubai. I went to Egypt, and the mistake I made was to be open in my communication aspect, to be fully transparent. Even though in school Arabic was my third language, I can follow the trends in when someone speaks in Arabic, but I'm not an Arabic speaker. So you can imagine that this is new. I was the first Indian CEO in Egypt, so
Yeah. Yeah.
there's also a cultural context.
Yeah.
And that hospital, which was the largest private hospital in Egypt, already had a history of two previous CEOs from the United Kingdom who had very short tenures. The first
Okay.
CEO who was appointed was there for roughly 2 years, and then he left. And my immediate predecessor was there for just 1 year. So I
Mm.
guess that the team was betting that I would have a rather short tenure. So that is
Yeah.
understandable, right?
Yeah.
So the mistake I made was to do so-called mini town halls
Yeah.
to get my executive assistant, who was a native Arabic speaker, and tried to explain to my team in different wards, clinical wards, where I made this PowerPoint presentation to tell them that, listen, folks, you are here today, and this is the journey I'm going to take you through. And at the end
Yeah.
of this 4 to 5 year period, this is where you're going to be. So I thought I was being this amazing CEO,
Yeah.
so open and transparent,
Yeah.
till I got a letter from the Egyptian Minister of Labor.
Yeah.
Those days, 2006, her name was Madam Fatma. So
Yeah.
she called me to her office, a formidable looking personality, a well built lady, and obviously speaking in Arabic. So usually when I meet, I say, salam alaikum, they say walaikum salam, then some but she was I tried my best to put on my charming self, but she was quite grim. Grim, and I knew that something is wrong. So she was pointing to a large table in which there was a huge pile of letters in Arabic, obviously written to her. Then she was telling me that, do you know what this letters are? These are letters of complaints from your own staff to me, saying that
Wow.
there's this Indian CEO who has come in, a foreigner, who's trying to take away all our jobs. And, the minister should really intervene. So I was utterly shocked,
Yeah.
because it looks like I totally lost the whole communication thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I was trying to say something good for my team, but their deciphering of my message was totally different. And well, that's what really happened. So when I went back after this meeting, of course, I reassured her that that is not what I'm trying to do, and
Yeah.
explained to her what. Then she was quite convinced, and I went back and changed my leadership style. So I said, no more so-called town halls, and no need to be so transparent. And then I realized what I told you a bit earlier, that history is very important. Like, you have societies which are either masculine or feminine societies,
Yeah.
and the behavior of people and culture is based on masculinity or feminine society. And if you remember, the greatest ruler in Egyptian history was Ramses II, the
Yeah.
great
Yeah.
great pharaoh. More than
Yes.
90 years of reign, and the Egyptian empire was at its glorious best. And when I went to Egypt in 2006, the president of Egypt was Hosni Mubarak.
Yeah.
It was the same president who was there when I was in school. When I was in
Yes.
school, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
what does this signal you? So this is a society and culture which actually respects authority.
Yeah.
I'm not saying authoritarian rulers, but there is a huge respect for leadership.
Yes. Yes.
That's when I in the CEO in Arabic is called Mudiril Tanfisi, is the
Yeah.
Arabic term for a chief executive officer.
Yeah.
Then I actually started embracing principles of what is to be a CEO in that role. And honestly, I succeeded in my own way, of course, exercising authority vested in the office, but at the same time, identifying leaders from my team, existing team, bring in
Yeah.
fresh blood, and
Yeah.
then we embarked on the transformative journey. So that's to do. And I guess the key success was turning around. This is one of my biggest turnaround project. This was a sick unit which I took over in 2006, and to make it to a cash cow
Yes.
in the 7 years I was there, and to build edifices of transformative change for that company. But then the other interesting experience was when the Egyptian Revolution, Arab Spring, hit us
Yeah.
in January 27, 2011. And I claim to be the only CEO in the world to have run a hospital, a private hospital, in the middle of a revolution. So till that day, I mean, Cairo is an incredible city. Cairo never sleeps.
Yeah.
And it's so safe for everyone to be at 3 a.m., 4 a.m.
Yeah.
in Cairo, in such a beautiful, incredible city. That day night, in my hospital, we had multiple gunshots coming from Tahrir Square, because the revolution hotspot was there. And that's when I really could see the training and the efforts. Like the previous year in 2010, I got this hospital Joint Commission accredited, and
Yeah.
nobody could
Yeah.
believe that this hospital, when I came in 2006, when I said that I'm going to get it accredited in 4 years' time, nobody could believe me. But
Yeah.
we did that. And
Yeah.
it was like a bottoms up approach, where every member of the team knew what the protocols were, what to do. And when such a crisis, when the whole nation was going into a meltdown, actually the team, the young people in that hospital, rose up to the challenge. And that was, I would say, one of my proudest moments, when I realized that when you really work hard with a group of a group of individuals and convert them into a strong team,
Yeah.
the results are there to see. Because actually the hospital rose to the occasion to take care of all those injured folks who came from Tahrir Square that day night. So that was Egypt for you.
I was having a conversation with a doctor, right? Very similar path to yours. He's trying to get to the business side of hospitals. A trained oncologist was trying to start a chain in India. And he had started a few hospitals during the pandemic. And I was having a conversation, and I said, how did you manage to survive during this time? Especially you're new, you're not very well known. So, and his hospital started to get converted into a COVID-19 hospital as well, like many other hospitals. So he just said, Sanat, you know what? CPR we use in many times, but for me, CPR is what I used over and over again. C being effective communication. He said, you're communicating effectively to every single employee, every single doctor, every single nurse that you have their back and we can do this, right? Is something that I honestly embraced and believed in. P is absolutely showing presence, whether it's walking the corridor, whether it's actually being in the critical wards. And he also mentioned this that, and some of it that you alluded to as well, is how being a clinician really helps leading hospitals, especially during this disruptive change, because you're able to speak the language. And what he said was rapid change. He said, every day was different. It's not only about the communication and the presence, but I should also embrace the rapid change and how I can take the organization through that. So it was pretty fascinating because you use CPR in a situation of survival, and he used it at the same context of bringing back a hospital and thriving. So a lot of what you said also resonates with that.
I went back to join Aster DM Healthcare as the CEO of this massive greenfield project in Kochi, in India, and that was more than $100 million investment, a 670 bed greenfield hospital designed by HKS of Dallas. So the mandate was twofold. One was to commission such a massive project in a price sensitive tier 2 town or a city like Kochi, for example, where you have strong competitors. So there were, except for the chairman and few board members, everyone else was a bit skeptical whether is it justified to have such a massive project and an investment in the city of Kochi. That was I mean, if this was there in Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore,
you would just be okay with it.
It would have been okay because those cities have the capacity to to accept such a project. But this was the first challenge. The second challenge was the name Aster. Aster was an unknown brand in India at that point of time. The chairman was probably well known to financial circles. I mean, obviously, and he is well known in the state of Kerala. But I would say beyond that, it was rather nobody knew Aster. Aster was an established brand in the city of Dubai, where it's headquartered. So the dual challenge was to commission this massive project and successfully ramp it up, as well as build a pan-India image for Aster as a new emerging healthcare player amongst existing competitors in the Indian market. So I think again, this principles of empathetic management, where so in that project I really focused on the clinical edifice to bring in the right consultants together. I hired every single doctor I personally hired there. In fact, the entire team, more than 1,500 staff members, I have played a role in hiring all of them for that project. So that kind of investment in handpicking the right people and weld them into clinical groups, clinical clusters, that was the key differentiator for its enormous success. And I strongly believe that the strong foundations which me and my team, and eventually it's a team which plays a key role. You can see the success story continuing year after year, and that's I would say it's one of the rock stars of clinical excellence and reputation today for the Aster Group anywhere in the world. So
that's fascinating.
These are some of the key lessons from different geographies and different parts of the world.
You should think about writing a book, Dr. Harish. This is some fascinating stories.
It's on my bucket list. Yes,
you've led hospitals during the financial crisis, during a revolution, during a pandemic. I think not everybody sees it in one single lifetime, and not everybody gets the opportunity to lead them successfully and across different cultures, which adds to the color and flavor of what you bring in as a leader. So thanks for sharing that. I think that was extremely insightful. And I've looked at a lot of your articles. I've looked at a lot of your discussions that you've had with various different media houses as well. And in your very early interviews with the Economic Times, right? You did mention about the importance of culture, importance of leadership, right? And you brought up some of this in your hospitals. But You quoted a particular example of a government hospital where your dad was hospitalized, and you were thoroughly impressed by the pure culture that hospital displayed, and as well as protocol and clinical pathways were absolutely well defined, and you almost consider it even today as a standard that you would want many hospitals to emulate. And considering it's a government hospital and it's living up to that standards, it's pretty commendable. Talk me through that story, Dr. Harish.
Yeah, so this was, I think it's almost 20, probably 20, 25 years back when my father had his first acute MI, and we had to rush him to this is a center of national eminence called the Sri Chitra Tirunal Institute for Medical Science and Technology in Trivandrum, which is very close to my home there.
Hmm.
And I was not in Trivandrum, and when my dad had to be taken there, and I think I was in Bangalore or in Hyderabad. I had to come down. Those days we come by train, and when obviously I was a doctor already, and my first encounter with the hospital system was trying to go and see my father. So then obviously the system told me that, well, you cannot come and see your father because there are designated visiting hours. So I tried my best to tell that, listen, I've come some so far away, and
Yeah.
I'm a doctor too, and I'm rather anxious. But they said, no, sorry,
Hmm.
you have to be respectful of our protocols in terms of visiting us. So that
Yeah.
is incident number one. Incident number two is that, well, when the visiting hour came and I could go and meet my father and also speak to the attending doctor,
Yeah.
so they were already planning for a interventional procedure in the cath lab.
Hmm.
So the way they gave took informed consent, because being his son, I was the person who had to give informed consent. They were quite explicit on what could go wrong. And I was just mentally imagining that, me being a doctor, and even though I know the process, it was honestly worrying for me. I was also anxious when this clinician took me through the process of informed consent. And then I realized that, oh my God, he's actually doing the right thing, because whatever he said is the really the gospel truth of
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
could go wrong. And then the whole process of taking informed consent and that. So the impressions which I took home was, an institution and its culture has to be represented by the security guard whom I first encountered,
Yeah.
and also the clinician, the young clinician, who was probably not. I mean, clearly he was not the senior most doctor, but the way he communicated with me. So these were two brand ambassadors of culture of that organization.
Yeah.
And this was a time when I was not a CEO. I was very much lower in the food chain. Yes, I remember I was a young executive in Apollo Hospitals in Hyderabad when this
Yeah.
incident happened. But it stuck in my mind ever since that there is no point in having policies, procedures, and all if your rank and file, the last man in the queue, if he doesn't embrace it and own the space. So when it comes to international accreditation, whether Joint Commission or Canadian or whatever, including the Indian standard of NAB, I always say that hospitals who do it from a marketing perspective,
Yes.
as getting a certificate to boost their brand, that's a big mistake. That's a
That's
clear
true.
mistake, because
Yeah.
we have this phenomena of voltage drop, that it's a triennial survey. So after you get your accreditation, people go back to
Yeah.
their default
Yes.
mode of doing whatever they have to do, and then everything ramps up again during the next accreditation,
Yes.
which I think is a great disservice to the great opportunity to change culture of safety.
Yes.
This is what I really believe in. So wherever I have been, I've been a champion of quality, especially from the most clinicians. They always wish good for their patients. All
Yeah.
clinicians,
Yeah.
it's their DNA. But you need to sit down and explain to the clinicians why such a governance system honestly helps them in their own mission. Because
Yeah.
otherwise, clinicians may suspect that this is some kind of voodoo,
Yeah.
wastage of time
Yeah.
where they are better served, looking at the clinical part of their career and not going into quasi management area. So this is where communication and empathetic communication is very important to convince your teammates on why such a journey is essential.
We forget that apart from the doctor, there are so many other stakeholders in your hospital who are important in the journey of a patient coming in and recovering and getting back home safely, right? In fact, I would almost say the lifeline of a hospital is the nurse are so important in your journey towards change.
So yeah.
Did you ever take any of your colleagues or teams to that hospital to walk the corridors to witness exactly what you witnessed?
I didn't. I No, I didn't.
Yeah,
The answer is no. But when you are in a position of influence in a leadership team,
yeah,
whether in Apollo, for example, I started at the bottom of the chain.
yeah,
Then you will have, as you like, I started off as an executive assistant to the managing director of
yeah,
Apollo Hospitals. Then became senior executive assistant manager, senior manager. Then became deputy general manager and general manager.
yeah.
All this in exactly 2 years flat. So
Oh
in
wow.
Apollo, when I was there, I had promotions every 6 months, literally.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh, but in that limited time, whatever influence you could do with your own teammates in terms of demonstrating empathetic leadership,
yeah,
I think that because you have to constantly tell that who's paying our salaries at the end of the day.
yeah,
It's actually the patient and I mean, obviously the patient and the family member because of whom we all exist. So, what is
yeah,
our job? Our
yeah,
job is to reverse the pyramid. Like a CEO should never think that he's sitting at the apex of the pyramid. It's the other way around.
yeah,
You should be at the bottom of the pyramid. Your job is to focus on the frontliners.
yeah,
And how can you every day imagine or even execute strategies or action points which makes the life of the frontliners more easier so that they can deliver better care for the patient. I think if you have a laser focus that who are your principal stakeholders, you cannot do
things get,
many mistakes.
yeah,
Of course, when roles change, like when you like on a strategic role, the stakeholders can be more diverse. It need not be just the patient. It has to be perhaps the doctor, the regulator, the shareholder. So those the bouquet of who are your principal stakeholders can be a bit larger as you go up the hierarchy.
we spoke about the culture, you spoke about how hospitals, how do they survive and then thrive. You know, across Asia, we're seeing a momentum of change where private hospitals need to start to cater to government funded patients, because the mission at the end of the day of every single country is to ensure that the quality of health of their population goes up. Now, we're seeing this big challenge in many of these hospitals at this point in time is you're designed for something. You're designed to be a private hospital to succeed, to be profitable. But at the same time, there is also pressure to be accessible and affordable. How does a hospital navigate through this as they're planning to grow, be profitable, but at the same time cater to a different cluster?
Regulatory scrutiny, media scrutiny, and also headwinds.
Yeah.
You can actually classify many of these environmental issues as headwinds
Mm.
if you're used to a certain culture of running a hospital.
Yeah.
But I don't consider them as headwinds at all. In fact, I would say the opposite. They're actually tailwinds. These are great opportunities for hospitals to reinvent themselves.
Yeah.
If you just look at another sector, aviation, as an
Yeah.
example,
Yeah.
aviation in the old days, you had full board service. I mean,
Yeah.
what's the point of an aircraft? Is to safely fly a passenger from A to B.
Yeah.
The purpose of a hospital is to ensure that any patient who enters its portals should be given the required care so that the clinical outcomes, what was supposed to happen, should happen. That's the similarity between aviation and hospitals. But what example which I would like to illustrate is of low cost carriers.
Yeah.
Now, you have many examples of successful low cost carriers around the world, including in Asia.
Yeah.
They also safely transport patients from A to B. They
Yeah.
also try to make a decent margin out of it. Now, the biggest variable factor for them is the aviation turbine fuel, which is pretty expensive because of commodity price challenges, and that goes up and down.
Correct.
Now, if you look at those airline companies, despite these kind of fluctuation, they give healthy returns to their shareholders. So there is
Yes.
something something which they got right. So what hospitals need to do is that really look at from a discipline perspective all the cost elements, what their which what the big worry is that people are not so granular in identifying all the cost elements which impact care of a patient without compromising quality. So I think that's an essential discipline which hospital management teams need to imbibe. The second part is you don't need to be like a full board airline. You don't need to be a full service hospital. You need to have the sense
Yeah.
of discipline to offer services to the market segment in your
That you're
community,
catering to. Yeah.
which is really asking for your kind of service. So
Yeah.
that's one part. See, some of the mistakes which hospital leaders make is in terms of capital allocation. You
Yeah.
find that within a certain zone of a few kilometers, there are multiple accelerators, there are multiple 3 Tesla MRIs,
Yeah.
there are multiple hybrid operating rooms, which doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
even among competitors, you can actually talk about cooperative competition where you can say that,
Yeah.
okay, hey, competitor, I know that you have this unique department, but I don't wish to do that. I would rather refer this patient to you. And maybe there are some cases which you don't choose to do. You can send it to me. I
Mm.
mean, that's a totally different paradigm of sustainability, even in a highly competitive space. Answering your question is, I think increased media scrutiny and regulatory scrutiny is actually good for the health of hospitals, especially
True.
private hospital providers,
Yeah.
because there is so much of wastage taking place.
Yes.
See, with due respect to models already prevailing around the world, unfortunately, we don't realize the massive wastage taking place in the healthcare space.
Yeah.
So, if you practice evidence based medicine, if you follow certain algorithms, you don't have to unnecessarily over investigate patients. For example, less reliance on diagnostics, less reliance on, let's say, prophylactic medications. All
Mm.
that will really reduce the cost of patient care. You have to also look at your bed turnover ratio. That there are unfortunately hospitals which have prolonged average length
Yeah.
of stay of patients where it's not really
Not
required.
required. Yeah.
And do you really need to admit all the patients who come to you? There are many patients, thanks to the pandemic, now we have realized that they don't even have to come
Yeah.
physically to an
Yeah.
outpatient department. You can manage through virtual care, home care. So these are the new paradigms which I think hospitals have an opportunity to absorb. There's a fear factor among hospital leaders. Hey, then how do we meet our financial objectives?
Yeah.
But always remember that to build a solid brand equity, you should first focus on the clinical excellence side. If you focus
Yeah.
on the clinical excellence side and the clinical outcomes and the experience of the patient, you cannot put a dollar value to what that means to that
Absolutely.
patient and the family member, because they are your lifelong customers or clients. So that's what, unfortunately, many hospitals take the short because you are looking at a quarterly objective, right? So you
Yeah.
looking at short gains over a quarter and then suffer long term.
Yeah.
So my theory is always the other way around. And this is like a contrarian objective, which many boards and also promoters sometimes do not get it because they find it difficult to understand that why is a hospital CEO going through a rather more expensive operational path
Mm.
or a rather more expensive capex route initially,
Mm.
in order, because that's where many people lose the plot. Like in Egypt, in my transformative project, I had told the promoter that I'm going to deliberately crash down your EBITDA. I'm going
Yeah.
to increase
Yeah.
operating
Yeah.
expenses. Over a 2 year period, I had a negative EBITDA growth. And this
Yeah.
is what I call a hockey stick phenomenon.
Correct.
So you
Correct.
crash your EBITDA and then
Yes.
consistently grow it over a
Yeah.
period of time.
Yeah.
So some expenses are essential, but
Correct.
that's where you, as an experienced healthcare manager, you need to know where those investments need to make. Of course, starting with human resources,
Yeah.
because it's all to do with people, and you also invest in technology, especially the digital aspects of technology, to make life easier for the
Yeah.
frontline healthcare workers.
Great points, Dr. Harish. We've also seen if you're completely premium, or if you're in one side of the spectrum, hospitals have figured out a way to deliver effectively. If you're completely low end, they figured out a way to deliver. But when you have a population mix walking in, where you have to provide what is called as a common lobby experience. We see a lot of the hospitals struggling too, because like you rightly said, they're not able to allocate capital and figure out what the right clinical service combination and pathway needs to be for different segments and their respective needs.
So I have a point here. So it like in medicine, we talk about primary care, secondary care,
Yeah,
tertiary care, and
yeah,
quaternary care.
yeah,
If you're a quaternary care facility which is into, let's say, multi-organ transplantation, high-end oncology work, neurosurgical work, therefore this population mix, what you said in the lobby space, right, is essential for excellence, because
correct,
you cannot retain those niche skill sets of clinicians
correct,
if you have a low throughput
correct,
of patients.
correct.
Now, I have seen in some countries that they make mistakes, right? So you've invested in a tertiary care hospital, which is capital heavy. It's
Yeah,
also manpower heavy.
yeah,
But then when you start looking at the niche clinical segments, it does not have the
the
volumes to
volume.
sustain these kind of cost overheads,
Yeah,
and also skill sets for that matter. So you need to have that. Like if you talk about pricing strategy, right? I've been a passionate advocate of tiered pricing.
yeah,
That you need to have tiered pricing to cater
absolutely.
to different segments, because that's how you need to sustain volumes. If you're not able to sustain volumes, I'm afraid there is something wrong in your model of care.
Yeah, absolutely. And recently, my mom had a stent put into her heart as well as a kidney. And the story of how efficient that was done in India, this was in one of the Apollo hospitals in India. From when she actually went for a normal test, she walked in, she got her test, and immediately they said, there is a 70% blockage. And of course, I'm not in India, so I was looped in on a virtual call through video conference. My mom was there in the ward, right, in the room, with the report projected in front of me, with the COE, head of COE, actually looped into the same call, and the doctor right next to her, explaining why the urgency of the change is. And that's powerful, right? To actually have from diagnosis to decision making, not more than an hour and a half, right? Where you're getting the most important people in the room make the decision. And then after that, she was already into the, OT. She had her stent placed, and she was, sent to the ward. And in 24 hours, she was back home. And she was back home inviting 20 people for lunch, right? 48 hours later. And and this is a story that I recall, because that's the kind of efficiency and model that you need to get to in order for you to actually be clinically excellent. What I want to close out on is, there's a lot of change that is happening in the hospital space, right? Hospitals are now starting to be looked at as places of critical care, where you start to address the preventive side of it, and you start to address all of the other low criticality issues outside of a hospital, right? You start to look at it in your primary care or online or AI, etc. And there's a lot of standardization coming. There's a lot of AI coming in. We have apps that can predict whether you have a cataract. You have AI engines that are able to look at your scan and say what is your potential to a certain malignancy. With all of this coming in, there is a certain set of doctors and clinical practitioners who say that the joy of practice is slowly going into the hands of technology. And there's a sense of restlessness. There's a sense of like, am I really a doctor right now, or am I just a driver to technology? What is your take on this, and how are you navigating? What have you heard in your hospitals? And would love to hear your thoughts on that.
So, medicine is an art and a science. And like what we discussed before, a long time back, there was a school of thought among practitioners that if you take a good history of a patient, general examination and systemic examination, you come to your differential diagnosis and you start empirical treatment, and that's it. It's a very cost efficient model of care. On the other side, when you also talk about a different philosophy of care, that's where instrumentation comes in. This is like instrument landing, right? So you use your diagnostics, whether it's laboratory or radiology, then you come to your differential diagnosis, and then you start your. So there's a cost obviously attached to that part. I think what I see clinicians right now, especially those clinicians who are really concerned about both clinical outcome and also cost of care, it's a value proposition. They
Yeah.
fall somewhere in between.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there is a lot of art when you educate young doctors,
Yeah.
and it all depends upon the quality of the faculty, the mentorship they're able to provide, and the leadership who are walking around in the clinical field, right? My hope is that, and this no textbook, and it's not like a SOP which tells you that okay, this is
Yes.
what you teach to young students. There is no substitution to a touch and feel of a patient. So
Yeah.
I don't see whatever technology you put in, the aha moment is something which you can't take away from medicine. To illustrate this, I would like to give you it's an actual quote said to me by my professor of medicine when I was in medical college. My professor explained the definition of a good doctor. He
Yeah.
said that imagine you're sitting in your consultation chamber, the patient opens the door and looks at you, and 50% of the symptoms disappear. You have not
Yeah.
even spoken a word, you
Yes.
have not said anything. 50% of symptoms disappear. It means that you're a good doctor. I'll
Yes.
give you another illustration. One of the toughest exams, practical exams to pass in medical college was pediatrics.
Yeah.
And many of my colleagues fail in the subject because we had this maverick examiner, a very senior professor. When you examine the child, it's actually a clinical case which you need to decipher what's the diagnosis.
Yeah.
But in the process of history taking and examination, if the child cries, then you fail in the exam.
Yeah.
So, and we all, I mean, what can you do? So, we were all a bunch of very worried and frightened bunch of young students. So we used to go the previous day and figure out who are those children who could be cases tomorrow, and try to build relationship with the
Yeah.
mothers and with the
Yeah.
children,
Yeah.
so that that the face is familiar to them.
Yeah.
Give them some
Yeah.
toys.
Yeah.
I think the message which the good professor was trying to tell us is that empathy and non-verbal communication, the body language
Yeah.
part. So these are things which technology can never substitute. And I'm one of those firm believers that human touch in the clinical practice should never be taken away and should not be taken away, because I think that what's make us special as humans.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Having said that, you can see the way technology is augmenting practice for better
Yeah.
clinical. Like one clear manifestation is in pattern recognition areas, whether it's to do with dermatology, radiology, tissue pathology. These three areas, there is a huge positive impact because of technology and AI, specifically to aid in better clinical diagnosis and outcomes. So that is already there. We see the advent of navigation technology for intraoperative techniques,
Yeah.
whether
Yeah.
it is neurosurgery, oncosurgery, or even in GI, gastrointestinal surgery. Navigation is already here to stay, which actually makes the operating time much lesser, and outcomes are also far superior, which is already there. You can talk about robotics.
Yeah.
Robotics help to increase the lifespan of a doctor, because there are many senior surgeons after a certain age they start getting
Yeah. Absolutely.
tremors.
Yeah.
So if you have a robot assisted surgery, then the tremors are totally eliminated. It gives you a much greater degree of movement than the human wrist, especially in a very narrow abdominal field. So that has also enhanced clinical outcomes in a very big way. So I think technology, in terms of augmenting skill level, supplementing skill levels, and also the ability to care for a much larger group of
Yeah.
patients through virtual, let's say virtual care or augmented care, it's really here to stay. Training of doctors, like simulation, like in many parts of the world, even getting cadavers for anatomy is very
Yeah.
difficult. But
Yeah.
now we can do virtual dissection using simulators and augmented reality tools, right? So I think these are all here to stay, and it's quite exciting the way technology is going to help in creation of a better doctor. I say the word better doctor, and that's why I give you the example that it has to be somewhere in between
In
the
between.
hybrid
Yeah.
model,
Yeah.
because while this doctor is technologically savvy, we need to also bring the emotional and the human quotient to this doctor
Correct.
in
Correct.
order to become more empathetic towards patient care.
Correct. I totally agree with you, Dr. Harish. But we're also seeing that in places where the doctor capability is a lot lower, right? The ability or qualifications of doctor are fairly basic. Technology is playing a pretty big role in actually, avoiding that 60% of error that they potentially will make, right? By the technology actually telling you that this is a high risk patient that you need to consider, right? Are you seeing this more acceptance post pandemic?
Yes, very much. One is that many of us were fixated that only younger doctors are
Yeah,
more adaptive to technology. But the pandemic and the lockdown ensured that the age barrier was totally eliminated.
yeah,
Everyone took to it like fish to water. It was quite
yeah,
surprising, not just on the provider side, but also on the consumer side. I mean,
yeah,
adoption rate just quadrupled during the pandemic. That's definitely here to stay. But what I think we need to also understand is intelligent deployment of tools. It's
yeah,
not like a one size fit all, and that's where judgment plays a key role. Like there are many diseases where you cannot manage it virtually. The
correct,
patient has to come physically, face to
correct.
face, see the doctor. The touch and feel has to be there. There has to be a physical examination. But what I also want to say is that it's an opportunity for educators, especially people responsible for curriculum,
Yeah,
clinical curriculum for not just for doctors, for technicians, for nurses, to relook at a new paradigm where you may not require that quantum of time which used to be before.
yeah, yeah,
To give you an example, we are now talking about skilling programs.
yeah,
Skilling programs for repetitive tasks, right? So, a nurse or an RN, a registered nurse, is such a precious resource for any hospital. But would you want to waste an RN for non-repetitive tasks, like
tasks. Yeah,
for example, in an ambulatory care setup where you just do a BP or a temperature check? You
correct,
don't need an
correct,
RN for that. But
correct.
if there's an interventional procedure required, which requires much higher competencies, yes, a nurse practitioner or a specialty nurse or an RN can be deployed for that. So I think there is a emerging recognition that you can create a new cadre of
Mm,
healthcare
mm,
workers which are actually more cost efficient,
yeah,
because it's just question of repetitive tasks, right? I want to illustrate one example that I can, because I know for a fact that some of the top cardiac centers, high volume cardiac
yeah,
centers in a specific country, the actual complex anastomosis of
mix.
the
Yeah,
arterial bypass
yeah,
is not done by a cardiothoracic surgeon, but
yeah,
done by a physician assistant,
yes,
because
yes,
that's all that the physician assistant will do thousands of coronary artery bypass graft, where
yes,
only this bypass graft is done by the physician assistant, not by the
yes,
surgeon.
yes.
So the cost of care drops
Correct,
down
correct,
phenomenally in that.
correct, correct.
So these are new dimensions what we are witnessing thanks to these big changes we are seeing all around us.
In a discussion with a hospital board recently, it was giving a view on what the outlook looks like. Again, we saw a lot of hesitancy in getting into, robotics, getting into proton therapy, getting into new age therapy, and preparing for the future, right? And also one part of it on not just preparation for the future, but how do you start to see your hospital as a hub for not just technology but also upskilling existing doctors, etc. That's pretty fascinating what's happening right now, both change from a patient standpoint, doctor standpoint. Dr. Harish, I absolutely thoroughly enjoyed the last 1 hour. I wish we could continue this conversation for a lot longer. Thank you so much for being on this podcast, Health for All. I absolutely cherish every single minute of it, right? Any last minute thoughts from you?
We are in an interesting world, and with while changes happen all around us, I think those of us in healthcare, we should remember that it's a real blessing. It's definitely a challenge, but it's a blessing to serve humanity, and we should never forget the core purpose of why we are here in the first place. It's all to do with service.
Wonderful. Wonderful. What a lovely way to end this podcast. Thank you so much, Dr. Harish, and have a wonderful day and week ahead.
Thank you. You
Take
too,
care.
Sanat.
Take care.
Bye
Bye
bye.
bye.
Bye bye.